The blood trail was too thick to be a deer. It was steaming in the snow, dark red, almost black against the white, fresh minutes old at most. I followed it thinking I'd find a wounded buck, maybe gut shot by some weekend hunter who couldn't track worth a damn. But what I found at the base of the pine tree was breathing too heavily. Its chest was heaving like bellows, and it was far, far too big. The thing slumped against the trunk wasn't moving. Not yet, just that labored breathing, each exhale sending up clouds of vapor that hung in the frozen air like ghosts. The temperature had dropped to 8 below that morning. My beard had ice in it. My fingers were going numb even through the gloves. But I stopped caring about the cold the second I saw its hand, because it had hands. Not paws, not hooves, hands. 4 fingers and a thumb, each tipped with a black claw as long as my pocket knife. The palm was leathered and calloused, dusted with coarse dark fur that ran up the forearm. The arm itself was massive, thicker than my thigh. The muscles beneath the matted fur looked like steel cables. I should have run. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, get back to the cabin, lock every door and window, and pretend I never saw this thing. But I didn't run. I stood there, my Winchester 30-30 raised halfway to my shoulder, finger resting against the trigger guard, watching this creature bleed out in my woods. That's when it opened its eyes. Yellow. Not amber, not gold, yellow, like a caution light burning through fog. The pupils were vertical slits, contracting even in the dim light filtering through the pines. And those eyes found me immediately, locked onto me with an intelligence that made my stomach drop. It wasn't looking at me like prey, it was looking at me like it was deciding something. The creature's muzzle was long canine, but the structure of the skull was all wrong. Too tall, too broad across the brow. When its lips peeled back, not in a snarl, but in what looked like pain, I saw teeth that belonged in a nightmare. Canines as long as my thumb, yellowed and sharp, with smaller serrated teeth behind them designed for shearing meat from bone. Blood was matted in the fur around its shoulder and neck. Deep gouges raked across its left side, 4 parallel wounds that had torn through fur and flesh down to the muscle. Something had gotten it good, something with claws. The blood trail I'd followed stretched back a quarter mile through the forest. It had dragged itself here. To die, maybe, or to hide. I lowered the rifle an inch, not dropping it, I'm not stupid, but lowering it enough to show I wasn't about to shoot. The thing's eyes tracked the movement. Its breathing was getting shallower, faster. The steam clouds were coming quicker now, more desperate. Easy, I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange in the silence of the woods. Easy. The creature's ear, pointed, mobile, covered in short fur, twitched toward my voice. It was dying. I could see it in the way its massive chest was starting to shudder, the way its fingers were barely keeping their grip in the snow. Whatever had attacked it had done serious damage. The wounds weren't just bleeding, they were gushing. Every heartbeat sent another pulse of dark blood streaming into the snow beneath it. I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what dying looks like. This thing had maybe 20 minutes, probably less. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. Call someone? And say what? Yeah, Sheriff. I've got a 7-foot wolf man bleeding out in my woods. Can you send an ambulance? They'd have me committed, or laughed off the phone. Shoot it. Put it out of its misery. My finger moved to the trigger. It would be the merciful thing. Quick, clean. But those yellow eyes were still watching me, still aware, still intelligent in a way that made pulling that trigger feel less like putting down an animal and more like murder. The creature made a sound, not a growl, not a howl. It was somewhere between a whimper and a wheeze, a wet gurgling noise that came from deep in its chest. Its hand, that disturbingly human hand, moved slightly, fingers digging into the snow. The claws left 4 perfect grooves in the frozen earth. It was trying to get up, failing, but trying. Don't, I said. Don't move. You're torn up bad. I don't know why I was talking to it. Maybe because those eyes seemed to understand. Maybe because I'd been alone in these woods for 3 years and talking to myself had become second nature. Maybe because some part of me recognized something in this creature's struggle that I understood. The will to survive, even when everything says you shouldn't. The creature settled back against the tree, those yellow eyes never leaving mine. Its breathing was getting worse. The blood pool beneath it was spreading, melting the snow in a dark crimson puddle that steamed in the cold air. I made a decision that would change everything. God help me, I muttered, and slung the rifle over my shoulder. I had a first aid kit back at the cabin, a big one. When you live 40 minutes from the nearest hospital, you learn to handle emergencies yourself. Stitching up a 6-inch gash from a table saw last summer had taught me that. I had gauze, medical tape, antiseptic, pressure bandages, even some veterinary antibiotics I kept for the stray dogs that sometimes wandered up from the highway. But first, I had to stop the bleeding. I shrugged off my coat, a heavy Carhartt jacket that had seen better days, and approached the creature slowly. Every step felt like it might be my last. This thing could probably tear me in half without breaking a sweat. Even wounded, even dying, it was massive. Its shoulder was level with my chest. "I'm gonna help," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Or I'm gonna try. Don't kill me for it, all right?" The creature's eyes narrowed, its nostrils flared, taking in my scent. I could see the muscles in its jaw tensing, relaxing, tensing again, deciding. Then impossibly it lowered its head. Just slightly, just enough. Permission, or surrender. Maybe both. I wadded up my jacket and pressed it against the worst of the wounds on its shoulder. The creature's whole body went rigid. A sound came from its throat, low, resonant, somewhere between a growl and a groan, the kind of sound you feel in your bones. "I know," I said. "I know it hurts, but you're bleeding out." I pressed harder. The jacket was already soaking through, warm and wet against my hands. The creature's claws flexed, digging deeper into the snow, but it didn't pull away. Didn't attack, just endured. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. Wet fur, blood, and something else. Something wild and musky that I'd never encountered before. Not quite wolf, not quite bear. Something older, something that shouldn't exist. The wounds were deep, 4 parallel gashes that started at the shoulder and ran down across the ribs. Whatever had done this had been trying to disembowel it. The edges of the wounds were ragged, torn rather than sliced. Another creature, then. Not a bullet, not a knife. A fight. "What the hell got you?" I asked, not expecting an answer. The creature's eyes slid toward the forest behind me, toward the north. Its lips pulled back again, and this time it was a snarl, low and hateful and full of rage that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something out there. Something it feared or hated, or both, right? I said. "We need to move. Can you walk?" The creature looked at me like I was an idiot. Fair enough. It could barely keep its eyes open. I'm 6'2" and weigh about 200 pounds. This thing was at least 7 feet tall and probably pushed 400 pounds of muscle, fur, and fury. There was no way I was carrying it back to the cabin, but I couldn't leave it here either. The temperature was dropping. It would freeze before it bled out, and if whatever had attacked it was still out there. "Come on," I said, moving to its side. "Lean on me." I wedged myself under its right arm, the one that wasn't torn to shreds, and tried to take some of its weight. It was like trying to support a falling tree. The creature groaned again, that deep chest rumbling sound, and somehow it pushed itself to its feet. We nearly went down immediately. My boots slipped in the bloody snow. The creature's legs were shaking, barely holding its weight. But we found our balance, barely. "The cabin's half a mile that way," I said, pointing south with my free hand. "We take it slow, one step at a time." The creature's head lolled toward me. Its muzzle was inches from my face. I could see the individual whiskers around its nose, the scars crisscrossing its snout. Could smell its breath, surprisingly clean like cedar and cold wind. Those yellow eyes studied me, really looked at me the way you might look at a puzzle you're trying to solve. Then it took a step forward, then another. We made it 10 feet before it stumbled. I went down with it, both of us crashing into the snow. The creature's weight pinned me for a moment and panic flooded through me. This is it. This is how I die. Crushed under a dying monster in the Minnesota wilderness, but then it rolled off me with a pained whine. "Get up," I gasped, spitting out snow. "Come on, get up." It took us 40 minutes to cover that half mile. We fell 3 more times. Twice I had to stop and repack the jacket against its wounds because the bleeding had soaked through. My arms were shaking from supporting its weight. My lungs were burning from the cold air. My back felt like it was going to snap, but we made it. The cabin appeared through the trees like a miracle, small, weathered, smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still air. I'd never been so happy to see that crooked porch in my life. Getting the creature up the steps was its own special nightmare. Getting it through the door meant turning sideways and practically dragging it. But we managed. We collapsed together just inside the entrance, both of us breathing hard, the warmth from the wood stove washing over us like a blessing. The creature's eyes were closed, its breathing was shallow. The pool of blood spreading across my floor said we weren't out of the woods yet, not even close. I staggered to my feet and grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink. My hands were shaking from cold, from exhaustion. from the absolute insanity of what I was doing, but I got the kit open and dumped its contents on the floor beside the creature. Gauze, antiseptic, medical tape, pressure bandages, needle, and thread. It all looked pathetically inadequate next to those gaping wounds. "This is gonna hurt," I said, unscrewing the cap on the antiseptic. "This is gonna hurt really, really bad." The creature's eyes opened. Just a slit, just enough to see me. I poured the antiseptic directly into the wounds. The sound that came out of the creature's throat shook the windows. It was a howl, pure, primal, full of agony, that cut off into a sharp clicking snarl as every muscle in its body went rigid. Claws dug into my floorboards, leaving deep gouges in the wood, but it didn't attack, didn't lash out. It just endured. I worked as fast as I could, packing the wounds with gauze, wrapping pressure bandages around its massive torso. My hands were covered in blood, hot and sticky, and so much darker than human blood. The creature flinched every time I touched a particularly deep gash, but it stayed still, stayed quiet except for those low, rumbling growls. By the time I finished, I'd used every bandage in the kit. The creature looked like a mummy, wrapped in white gauze that was already starting to stain red. But the bleeding had slowed. Not stopped. Wounds that deep wouldn't stop bleeding for hours, but slowed. It was something. I sat back against the wall, exhausted, and looked at the creature sprawled across my floor. 7 feet of muscle and fur and claws, breathing shallowly, yellow eyes half open and watching me through the pain. "What are you?" I whispered. The creature's ear twitched. Its gaze held mine for a long moment. Then its eyes slid closed and it went still. Not dead. I could still see its chest rising and falling, but unconscious, finally giving in to the pain and the blood loss and the exhaustion. I should have been terrified. Should have grabbed my rifle and put it out of its misery right then. Should have done 1,000 things that made sense. Instead, I grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it over the creature's body. Then I sat down beside it, my back against the wall, the rifle across my lap, and waited to see if it would survive the night. Outside, the temperature dropped to 15 below. Inside, something impossible breathed steady and slow beside my dying fire, and somewhere in the north woods, something else was watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that first night. How could I? The creature was sprawled across my living room floor, taking up space from the wood stove to the bookshelf. 7 feet of predator, unconscious and bleeding, 3 feet from where I sat with my back pressed against the wall and the Winchester across my lap. The fire was dying. I should have gotten up to feed it, but that would mean stepping over the creature, walking past those claws, getting close to that mouth. So I sat in the growing cold and watched its chest rise and fall. The smell was getting worse, not just blood anymore, though there was plenty of that, soaking through the bandages, pooling dark and sticky on the floorboards. But underneath the copper tang of blood was something else, something organic and wrong, wet fur that hadn't dried properly, the sour sweet stink of infection starting to set in, and that musk thick and heavy, coating the back of my throat like oil. It smelled wild, ancient, like something that had crawled out of the earth itself. The creature's breathing changed around 3 a.m. It got shallower, faster. The steady rhythm broke into something ragged and desperate. Its whole body twitched, muscles jumping under the matted fur. One of its hands, God, those hands, flexed claws, scraping against the floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. Fever dream. Had to be. The wounds were infected. Its body was trying to fight off something it probably couldn't survive. I should have let it happen. Should have just sat there and waited for nature to take its course. Instead, I found myself crawling forward on my hands and knees, rifle forgotten, reaching out to touch the creature's shoulder. The heat hit me before I made contact. It was radiating off its body in waves, not the comfortable warmth of a sleeping dog, but a scorching, sick heat that felt wrong, feverish. My hand hovered an inch above its fur, feeling the temperature like I was holding it over a stove burner. "You're burning up?" I whispered. The creature's eyes snapped open. Just one, the left one. The right side of its face was pressed against the floor, that yellow eye fixed on me, huge and dilated, the pupil blown wide in the darkness. For a moment, there was no recognition in it, no intelligence, just pure animal instinct, pain and fear and the ready violence of a cornered predator. I froze. My hand was still extended, inches from its shoulder. My throat was exposed. I was on my knees, off balance, completely vulnerable. If it wanted to kill me, this was the moment. The eye blinked, slowly, like it was swimming up through murky water, and something shifted behind it, some awareness returning. The creature made a sound, low, questioning, almost like a whine. Its gaze moved from my face to my extended hand, then back again. "Favor," I said, my voice cracking. "You've got a fever." The wounds are infected. I don't know why I kept talking to it. Maybe because that eye seemed to understand. Maybe because the silence was worse. The creature's muzzle wrinkled, pulling back from its teeth in what might have been pain or might have been a warning. I could see the individual fangs yellowed at the base, white and sharp at the tips, could see the dark pink of its gums, the thick tongue behind the teeth. Saliva dripped from its lower jaw, clear and viscous. One bite. That's all it would take. Those jaws could crush a deer's spine. I need to check the bandages, I said. Can I touch you? Asking permission from a monster. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. The creature's ear, torn at the tip, scarred along the edge, swiveled toward my voice. What watched me for a long moment, that yellow eye unblinking. Then its head lowered back to the floor. Not much, just an inch, but it was enough. Okay, you can touch me, but be careful. My hand finally made contact with its shoulder, and Jesus Christ, it was like touching a furnace. The fur was coarse and thick, matted with dried blood and God knows what else. Beneath it, the skin was burning. I peeled back the blanket I'd thrown over it. The bandages were soaked through dark red in some places, a sickly yellowish green in others. The smell that rose up made my eyes water. Infection. Bad. This is gonna hurt, I said, reaching for the medical tape. I'm sorry. This is really gonna hurt. I started unwrapping the bandages from its torso, working carefully around the massive barrel of its chest. The creature's breathing got faster. That low whine turned into something closer to a growl, not threatening, just hurting. Its claws dug into the floorboards again, leaving fresh gouges. When I pulled the last layer of gauze away from the wounds, I had to bite back a curse. The gashes were angry and inflamed, the edges puffy and weeping clear fluid mixed with pus. The skin around them had turned a dark, mottled purple. Heat was radiating from the wounds like they were cooking from the inside. Okay, I said more to myself than the creature. Okay, antiseptic, more antibiotics, cold compress. I stood up carefully, watching the creature for any sign of aggression, and moved to the kitchen. My legs were shaking, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion. I couldn't tell anymore. The creature's eye followed me the entire time. Not just tracked me, studied me, watched the way I moved, the way I pulled supplies from the cabinet, the way my hands shook when I filled a bowl with cold water and grabbed a clean cloth. It was observing, learning. That was somehow more terrifying than the teeth. When I came back and knelt beside it, the creature shifted slightly, rolling more onto its side to give me better access to the wounds. The movement was deliberate, cooperative. It understood what I was trying to do. Smart, I muttered. You're too damn smart. I started cleaning the wounds again, and this time the creature didn't just endure it, it participated. When I needed to reach the gashes along its ribs, it lifted its arms slightly, holding the position even though I could see the muscles trembling with effort. When I pressed the cold compress against the worst of the infection, it tensed but didn't pull away. But those eyes never left me, yellow and intelligent and completely, utterly wrong. Animals don't look at you like that. They don't watch you with that kind of focus, that kind of awareness. They don't tilt their head slightly when you speak, like they're parsing the words. They don't seem to be thinking about you. This thing was thinking about me. I could feel it in the weight of its gaze, in the way its pupils dilated and contracted as it studied my face, in the subtle movements of its ears, swiveling to catch every sound I made. It was figuring me out, processing, calculating. Who are you? Why are you helping me? Can I trust you? Should I kill you? All of that in those eyes, questions I couldn't answer, because I wasn't even sure myself. There, I said, tying off the last fresh bandage. That's the best I can do. I sat back on my heels, suddenly aware of how close I was, how vulnerable. My face was maybe 2 feet from its muzzle. I could smell its breath again, that strange cedar scent, but now tinged with the sourness of sickness. The creature's nostrils flared. Taking in my scent, the way I was taking in it, we stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Predator and prey, locked in some strange détente. Neither of us quite sure what the other was going to do. Then the creature did something that made my blood run cold. It raised its hand slowly, deliberately, and reached toward my face. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to throw myself backward, to grab the rifle and put 3 rounds through its skull. I didn't move. The hand kept coming, massive, clawed, matted with dried blood. Could have crushed my skull like an egg, could have torn my throat out with one swipe. Instead, the back of one finger, the one without the claw, extended, touched my cheek. Gently. So gently I barely felt it. The pad of its finger was rough and calloused, hot with fever. It traced down my cheek to my jaw, the claw tip hovering a millimeter from my skin. never quite touching. The gesture was almost curious, exploratory. What are you? What kind of creature helps when it should run? I stopped breathing. The creature's eyes were inches from mine now. I could see the striations in the yellow iris, the way the pupil was slightly off-center. Could see my own reflection in the dark shine of its eyes, small, pale, terrified. Then the hand dropped away. The creature's eye closed, its breathing evened out, and just like that, the moment was over. I scrambled backward until I hit the wall, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack a rib. My hand found the rifle, gripped it like a lifeline. The creature didn't move, didn't open its eyes, just lay there breathing, its massive chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It had touched me. This thing, this impossible nightmare creature, had reached out and touched my face with something that looked almost like gentleness. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next day was worse. The fever broke around noon, but not before the creature went through something that looked terrifyingly close to convulsions. Its whole body seized up, back arching, claws, scrabbling against the floor. That howl came again, the one that shook the windows. But this time, it was different. Higher, more desperate. It was screaming. I did what I could, held the cold compress to its forehead, tried to keep it from thrashing so violently it tore the wounds open again. Got kicked in the ribs for my trouble, not deliberately, just a spasm that sent me flying into the bookshelf. 2 ribs cracked. I felt them go, but I crawled back, kept trying. Because that sound, that screaming, it was the sound of something that didn't want to die. When the fever finally broke, the creature went limp. For a horrible minute I thought it was dead, but then I saw the shallow rise of its chest, felt the faint heat still radiating from its body. Alive, barely. I collapsed beside it, clutching my ribs, too exhausted to move. That's when I noticed the details I'd been too terrified to see before. Scars, dozens of them, crisscrossing the creature's body under the fur. Old wounds, healed over, patches where the fur didn't quite grow back properly. A notch taken out of its right ear, claw marks raked across its shoulders that had to be years old. This thing had been fighting its whole life, and something about that made it seem less like a monster and more like... what? A survivor? A soldier? I reached out, carefully, always carefully, and ran my fingers along one of the old scars on its forearm. The fur was thinner there, the skin beneath tough and leathered. "What the hell are you?" I whispered. "Where did you come from?" The creature's eye cracked open. Just a sliver, just enough to see me. For a moment, I thought I saw something in that yellow gaze, something that might have been sadness or weariness. I don't know, and I don't think you'd understand if I could tell you. The eye closed again. I sat there for a long time, listening to it breathe, trying to process what I'd gotten myself into. Day 3 was when things got strange. The creature woke up properly this time, not feverish, not delirious, aware. I was at the kitchen sink trying to scrub dried blood out from under my fingernails when I felt the weight of its gaze on my back. That prickling sensation of being watched by something that could kill you without breaking a sweat. I turned slowly. The creature was sitting up, its back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of it, one hand resting on its bandaged torso. Looked exhausted. The fur around its eyes was matted and dark. Its ears drooped slightly, but it was upright, and it was watching me with those yellow eyes, head tilted slightly to one side. "Hey," I said, stupidly, "what else do you say to a monster in your living room?" The creature's muzzle twitched. Not quite a snarl, not quite. Something else. We stared at each other across the small cabin. The wood stove crackled between us. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and silent. The creature's gaze moved around the room. Took in the bookshelf, the small kitchen, the window with its frost-covered glass. Took in the rifle, leaning against the wall. Too far from me, too close to it. Its eyes came back to me. "You live here alone." It wasn't a question, it was an observation. One predator recognizing isolation in another. "Yeah," I said, "just me." The creature made a sound, not a growl, not quite a huff, something thoughtful. Then it did something that nearly gave me a heart attack. It tried to stand. "Don't." I started forward without thinking. "You'll tear the stitches." The creature made it halfway up before its legs gave out. It went down hard, catching itself on one hand, a sharp whine escaping its throat. I was beside it before I realized I'd moved. Hands on its shoulder, trying to steady it, pushing it back toward the floor. "Easy, easy. You're not ready yet. You lost too much blood." The creature's head swiveled toward me. We were close enough that I could feel the heat of its breath on my face, could see every detail of its features, the whiskers on its muzzle, the small scars around its nose, the way its lips were pulled back slightly from its teeth. Close, it looked even less like a wolf and more like something else entirely. The structure was all wrong. The intelligence in those eyes was all wrong. "Sit," I said firmly, "the way you'd command a dog. Sit down before you hurt yourself worse." The creature's eyes narrowed. For a second I thought I'd gone too far. Thought those jaws were going to close around my throat. Then, slowly, it lowered itself back to the floor, obeying. Not because it was weak, though it was. Not because it had to. Because it chose to. "Good," I said, my voice shaking slightly. That's good." The creature huffed again. This time it sounded almost amused. "You're giving me orders in your house. Interesting." I pulled my hands back, suddenly very aware that I'd just been touching it, ordering it around, treating it like an injured animal instead of a creature that could rip me limb from limb. The creature settled back against the wall, watching me with those unblinking yellow eyes. "You need food," I said, needing to do something, to move, to break the intensity of that stare. "I don't know what you eat, but you need food. You're wasting away." I could see it now that the initial terror had faded. The creature was too thin, ribs showing beneath the fur, hip bones prominent. When had it last eaten? Before the fight that nearly killed it? Days ago? Weeks? The creature's ears pricked forward at the word food. Its nostrils flared. Right. Predator. Food was a universal language. I went to the freezer and pulled out a venison roast I'd been saving. 2 pounds of meat, frozen solid. I held it up. "I can cook it," I said. "Or, can you eat it raw?" The creature's eyes locked onto the meat with an intensity that made my stomach drop. Its whole body tensed. Saliva dripped from its jaws. I tossed the frozen roast. The creature caught it one-handed, snatched it out of the air with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that injured. For a moment, it just held it, staring at the meat like it couldn't quite believe it was real. Then it bit down. The sound of its teeth crunching through frozen meat and bone was something I'll never forget. It didn't chew, didn't savor, just tore into the roast with a desperation that spoke of starvation. Blood frozen and fresh dripped from its muzzle. Its teeth made quick work of meat that should have taken hours to thaw. In less than 3 minutes, the roast was gone. The creature licked its muzzle, its hand, the floor where blood had dripped. Then those yellow eyes came back to me. More. Not demanding, not quite, but hopeful, hungry. "Jesus Christ," I muttered. "How long has it been since you ate?" I gave it another roast, then another. It went through 6 pounds of venison like it was nothing, and I could see it wasn't nearly enough. This thing needed to hunt, but it could barely stand. The creature settled back against the wall, licking blood from its claws with a tongue that was far too long. For the first time since I'd found it, some of the desperation had left its eyes. "Better?" I asked. The creature's gaze met mine, and I swear it nodded. Just once, just slightly, but it nodded. We sat there in the growing darkness, predator and prey, neither of us quite sure what happened next. Outside, the temperature dropped to 20 below. Inside, something impossible digested venison by my dying fire. And I realized with creeping horror that I couldn't let it leave. Not because I was keeping it prisoner, but because if I opened that door, if I let it go out into the cold in this condition, it would die. And somehow, impossibly, I'd started to care whether it lived. That night, I woke to find it watching me. I'd fallen asleep in the chair, rifle still across my lap, head tilted back against the wall. When I opened my eyes, the creature was sitting 3 feet away, perfectly still, yellow eyes glowing slightly in the moonlight coming through the window. Just watching. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. "How long have you been?" My voice came out as a croak. The creature tilted its head, didn't answer, obviously. Couldn't answer. But those eyes said everything. "I've been watching you sleep, studying you, trying to understand why you're doing this. Deciding if I should kill you or not." I gripped the rifle tighter. The creature's gaze dropped to the gun, then back to my face. "You won't shoot. We both know that. If you were going to, you would have done it 3 days ago." And it was right. We sat there in the darkness, watching each other, both of us pretending we weren't terrified. Finally, the creature's eyes drifted closed. Its breathing evened out. But I knew it wasn't really asleep. And it knew I knew. This was purgatory. Living room purgatory. Trapped in a 10 by 12 cabin with a nightmare that was learning my patterns, my weaknesses, my habits, learning what I was, the way I was learning what it was. And that mutual understanding was somehow more terrifying than the teeth it left on the 7th day. I woke up that morning to find the cabin door open, not broken, not torn from its hinges, just open, standing wide like an invitation to the cold. Snow had drifted across the threshold, covering the bloodstains on the floor. The creature was gone. No goodbye. No sound. Just empty space where something massive had been breathing 12 hours before. I should have felt relief. I didn't. I stood in that doorway for 20 minutes, staring out at the tree line, waiting for those yellow eyes to appear in the shadows, waiting for it to come charging back, to finish what it had started, to collect on whatever debt I'd created by keeping it alive. But the forest was empty. Silent. Too silent. That's when I noticed the tracks. They led from my door into the snow, each footprint massive, easily twice the size of my boot. 3 toes, splayed wide for balance, tipped with claw marks that dug deep into the frozen earth. The tracks were spaced far apart. It had been running strong enough to run. I'd done that. I'd nursed a predator back to health, and now it was out there. Somewhere. The tracks disappeared into the tree line heading north, the same direction it had been looking that first day when I'd asked what attacked it, going home, or going hunting. I closed the door, locked it, pushed the bookshelf in front of it for good measure, and I waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. That was worse. The woods around my cabin had always been alive with sound crows arguing in the pines, squirrels chattering, the distant yipping of coyotes at night. In winter, you'd hear the crack of branches breaking under snow weight, the whoosh of a snowy owl taking flight, the scrabbling of rabbits in the underbrush. Now there was nothing, just wind through the trees, just my own breathing, just the creak of the cabin settling. The silence pressed against my eardrums like hands over my ears. It was physical, oppressive, wrong. I'd step outside to split firewood, and the axe would crack through the log with a sound like a gunshot, and nothing would react. No birds startling from the branches. No deer bounding away through the snow. Nothing. The forest was holding its breath. I started keeping the rifle closer, not just nearby on me, strapped across my back when I went to the woodpile 20 feet from the cabin, propped against the sink when I washed dishes, beside the toilet when I pissed. I was being watched. I couldn't prove it, couldn't point to anything concrete, but I knew. That feeling of eyes on the back of your neck, of being tracked, of being studied, it never went away. Some mornings I'd find tracks, not approaching the cabin, never approaching, circling, always at exactly 200 yards out. Like some invisible boundary had been drawn, the 3-toed prints would loop around the entire perimeter of the property, sometimes following the same path multiple times, wearing a trail into the snow. It was marking territory, my territory, or claiming it as its own. I couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty was eating me alive. Week 4, my dog disappeared. Barkley. 12-year-old mutt, more gray than brown, deaf in one ear, mean as hell to strangers. He'd been my only company for 3 years. I let him out to pee one morning, same routine we'd done 1,000 times, and he made it 5 feet from the porch before he stopped. Just stopped. Stood there in the snow, head up, ears forward, staring at the tree line. Bark, I called. Come on, boy, do your business. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stared at the trees with every muscle in his body locked tight. Then his hackles went up, not just raised, standing straight up along his spine like quills. His lips peeled back from his teeth. A sound came from his throat I'd never heard before, not a growl, not a bark, a whine, high and terrified and utterly helpless. Barkley, get back here, he bolted, straight into the woods, running full speed. That terrified whine turning into panicked yelping that got further and further away until the trees swallowed it completely. I grabbed the rifle and ran after him, found his tracks in the snow. Erratic, desperate. He'd been running blind, crashing through underbrush, slipping on ice. The tracks went on for maybe 300 yards. Then they stopped. Not gradually, not like he'd slowed down or changed direction. They just stopped, mid-stride. One set of paw prints, then nothing but undisturbed snow. No blood, no signs of struggle, no body, just absence. I stood there in the woods, surrounded by that terrible silence, and I understood something that made my blood run cold. Whatever had been watching me had taken my dog, not killed it. There would have been blood, evidence, something. It had taken it, as a message or a warning, or maybe just because it could. I didn't call for Barkley, didn't search anymore. I walked back to the cabin, locked every door and window, and didn't go outside for 3 days. The presence started in week 6. I woke up one morning to find something on my porch, a deer hawn, fresh, still warm, laid carefully on the boards right in front of the door, positioned so I'd have to step over it to leave. The meat had been torn from the carcass, not cut. Teeth marks scored the bone, but it had been placed, not dropped. set down deliberately, an offering or a threat. I stared at it for 10 minutes before I worked up the courage to open the door. The meat steamed in the cold air. Frost was already forming on the exposed muscle. There were tracks in the snow, the same three-toed prints, massive and deep. They came from the tree line, approached the porch, retreated back to the forest. It had been here while I was sleeping, close enough to touch the door. I looked at the meat, at the tooth marks, at the way it had been positioned like a gift. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. I should have thrown it in the woods, should have burned it, should have done anything except what I did. I brought it inside, cooked it, ate it, because some part of me understood refusing the gift would be an insult, and I couldn't afford to insult whatever was out there. The next week, there was another haunch. Then a rabbit, throat cleanly broken, laid on the porch rail. Then half an elk, butchered with precision that shouldn't have been possible without tools. I ate all of it, and every time, I felt those eyes watching from the tree line, waiting to see what I'd do, waiting to see if I'd accept. Month 3, I started seeing it, not clearly, never clearly, just glimpses. A shadow moving between trees that was too tall, too broad. A shape on a ridge against the sunset that stood on 2 legs before dropping to all 4s and vanishing. Yellow eyes reflecting my flashlight beam from impossible distances there and gone in a heartbeat. It was circling closer. The tracks were still at 200 yards, but the sightings were getting nearer. 150 yards, 175, tightening the noose. I stopped going outside except for the woodpile, and even then only during daylight. I pissed in a bucket rather than walk to the outhouse after dark. I started sleeping in shifts, 3 hours on, 3 hours sitting by the window with the rifle, watching the tree line. The presents kept coming, but now they were different. Week 10, a coyote skull, cleaned perfectly, placed on my chopping stump. Week 12, a circle of stones around the cabin, each one the size of my fist, placed exactly 10 feet apart. Week 14, a structure in the clearing, branches woven together into something that looked almost like a shelter or a marker or a shrine. It appeared overnight. I hadn't heard a sound. It was building things, making things, and I understood with creeping horror that it wasn't just watching me, it was trying to communicate. Month 5, the winter storms got worse. 3-day blizzards that buried the cabin under 4 feet of snow. Wind that screamed through the trees like something dying. Temperature drops to 40 below that made the cabin walls crack and pop. I was completely cut off, no way in or out, just me and the howling dark and whatever was out there. That's when I started hearing it at night. Footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy, moving from one end of the cabin to the other, then back again. Testing the structure, finding weak points. I'd lie in bed, rifle clutched to my chest, listening to those footsteps directly above my head, separated from me by 6 inches of wood and tar paper. Could come through that roof anytime it wanted. I knew that. It knew I knew, but it didn't. It just walked back and forth, back and forth. I'm here. I haven't forgotten you. I'm always here. Sometimes I'd hear breathing outside the window, deep and wet and far too close. The glass would fog from the heat of its breath. I'd see the outline of a massive head silhouetted against the frost, yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. We'd stare at each other through the glass, me inside, it outside, neither of us moving. Then it would vanish like smoke, and I'd be left wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. I hadn't imagined it. The frost on the window would be melted in a perfect circle where its breath had hit the glass. Month 7. I found the bones. The storm had finally broken, and I'd ventured out to survey the damage. Trees down everywhere, snowdrifts higher than my head, the world buried and silent and dead. That's when I saw the pile. 50 yards from the cabin, arranged in a clearing I'd never noticed before. Bones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Deer skulls, coyote ribs, elk vertebrae, small animal bones I couldn't identify. All of them cleaned perfectly, white and pristine, arranged in a careful spiral pattern that radiated out from a center point. At the center, Barkley's collar. I stood there staring at it, my breath coming in short gasps, frost forming on my beard. This was a graveyard, or a trophy room, or something else entirely, something I didn't have words for. The bones were arranged with purpose, with meaning, like art, or language, or ritual. It was trying to tell me something. This is what I am, this is what I do, these are the things I've killed. Or maybe, these are offerings, these are prayers. This is worship. I didn't touch the collar, didn't disturb the bones. I backed away slowly, feeling those invisible eyes on me, and I didn't look back until I was inside the cabin with every lock engaged. That night I heard howling, not one voice, multiple, at least 3, maybe more. They started miles apart, calling to each other across the frozen wilderness. Long, mournful howls that weren't quite wolf, weren't quite anything I'd ever heard. They were answering each other. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. And I realized with absolute certainty it wasn't alone anymore. It had brought others. Month 8, I stopped sleeping entirely. The howls were constant now. Every night, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, surrounding the cabin, coordinating. The presence had stopped. No more meat on the porch. No more structures in the clearing. The silence was back, but different now. Not empty. Waiting. Something was about to happen. I could feel it in the air, and the way the temperature dropped even further, and the way the trees seemed to lean away from the cabin like they were trying to escape. I spent my days checking sightlines, reinforcing the door, counting ammunition. I had 43 rounds left. It wouldn't be enough. On the night of February 23rd, 8 months to the day since I'd found the blood trail, I was sitting by the window when I saw them. 3 shapes at the edge of the tree line. Massive, upright, perfectly still. Yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. 3 pairs watching. The one in the middle was bigger than the others. I knew that build, knew those scars. It was back, and it had brought family. We stared at each other across the frozen clearing for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, the center one raised its hand. Not threatening, not aggressive. It raised its hand in what looked almost like a wave. Hello? Remember me? The one you saved? I've come back, like I promised. My finger moved to the trigger, but I didn't fire, because I could see now what I couldn't see before. They weren't positioned for an attack. They were positioned like a delegation, like they were waiting for permission, like they wanted to be invited in. And that's when I understood the terrible truth. This wasn't a haunting. This was a courtship. The creature hadn't been terrorizing me for 8 months. It had been acclimating me, training me, teaching me to accept its presence the way you might gentle a wild horse. The presence, the watching, the careful distance. It had been deciding if I was worth keeping alive, and apparently I'd passed the test. The creature lowered its hand, tilted its head. So, what now, human? Will you open the door? Will you let us in? Or will you make us break it down? I sat there with my finger on the trigger, staring at 3 nightmare creatures standing in my yard, and I realized I had absolutely no idea what to do. Outside, the temperature dropped to 50 below. Inside, I started laughing, because I was about to make the second worst decision of my life. The first was saving it in the first place. The second was reaching for the door. It was mid-January when the debt came due. The temperature had plummeted to 20 below zero, the kind of cold that makes the timber of the cabin snap and pop in the night like firecrackers. I hadn't slept a full night in 8 months. Every time the wind hit the eaves, every time a branch scraped the roof, my mind went back to the living room floor, to the copper smell of blood and the heat radiating off a creature that shouldn't exist. Then the power went out. It didn't flicker. It didn't surge. It just died. And the silence that followed wasn't normal. When you live in the deep woods, the night is never truly quiet. There's always the wind or the trees settling or the distant yip of a coyote. But this silence was heavy. It was a vacuum. It was the sound of the woods holding its breath. I didn't reach for my flashlight. I didn't grab the rifle. Instinct, some primal, deeply buried human instinct, told me that holding a weapon would just make me a threat. And if I was a threat, I was dead. I stayed in the rocking chair, barely breathing, watching my breath plume into white mist in the freezing air of the living room. I forced myself to stand. My knees felt like water. I walked to the front window, placing my hands flat against the freezing glass. The frost was creeping up the panes, but there was a clear patch right in the center. I looked out into the clearing. The moonlight was blinding on the fresh snow, painting the yard in sharp blue contrast. The tree line was 50 yards away. At first, I thought they were just shadows. The pines out here grow thick, and the dark plays tricks on your eyes. But shadows don't breathe. Shadows don't exhale plumes of white steam into the negative 20-degree air. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 5 of them. They were standing at the edge of the property line, just outside the radius where the porch light usually hits. They were completely still. If I hadn't been looking specifically for them, I would have never seen them. They stood on 2 legs. Even slouched forward, they had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The sheer mass of them, it broke my brain. You try to rationalize it. You tell yourself it's a bear on its hind legs. But bears are clumsy on 2 feet. These things stood perfectly balanced, arrogant, like they owned the earth they were standing on. The one in the center stepped out of the tree line, the alpha. I knew it was him. Even in the dark, I recognized the gate. It was a slight limp on the left side, the same leg I had pulled 3 ounces of buckshot out of 8 months ago. The same torso I had stitched up with heavy-duty fishing line while it watched me, completely awake, choosing not to tear my throat out. The other 4 moved with him. They didn't rush. There was no frenzy. That was the most terrifying part. If they had charged the cabin, howling and snapping, it would have just been an animal attack. But this was a military formation, was an execution squad. They spread out as they crossed the yard, flanking the cabin. Cutting off the front door, the back door, and the windows, I backed away from the glass. I backed up until I hit the opposite wall, and I slid down to the floor. I wrapped my arms around my knees like a child. I was a grown man, a hunter, a survivor, and I was sitting in the dark, crying without making a sound. The temperature in the cabin was dropping fast, but I was sweating. Cold, terrified sweat. I heard the first footstep hit the porch. The wood screamed. My cabin was built sturdy, thick oak and iron nails, but the floorboards bowed under the weight of whatever just stepped onto them. Then came another step, and another. I closed my eyes. I waited for the door to splinter. I waited for the hinges to blow out and for the freezing wind to rush in, followed by teeth and claws. I braced myself for the pain. I prayed it would be fast. I prayed they would take my head first so I wouldn't have to feel them eating the rest of me. He was right on the other side of the door. The wood was 1.5 inches thick, but I could feel the heat of him radiating through it. I could hear his lungs expanding. He was smelling me. He knew exactly where I was sitting. I held my breath. My lungs burned, but I refused to make a sound. Something hit the porch. It was a wet, heavy, sickening sound, like dropping a wet mattress onto concrete. The whole cabin shook with the impact. Then, silence. I waited for the crash. I waited for the door to give way, but it never happened. He stepped off the porch. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I sat on the floor, freezing, shivering so violently my teeth felt like they were going to crack. Eventually, the sun started to rise. The dark blue light in the cabin slowly turned into a pale, dead gray. When I finally found the courage to stand, my legs were numb. I walked back to the window and looked out. The yard was empty. The 5 sets of tracks were there, deeply entrenched in the snow, but the creatures were gone. They had retreated. I walked to the front door. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. I didn't want to open it. Everything inside of me screamed to board the door shut and hide in the cellar. But the smell was already seeping through the cracks in the weather stripping. It was the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. I pulled the door open. Lying on my welcome mat, blocking the entire entryway, was a full-grown black bear. It was massive, but it looked like it had been hit by a freight train. Its neck was broken at a horrific angle. Its chest was torn wide open. The ribs cracked outward like a morbid flower. It wasn't eaten. No meat was taken off the bone. It was just killed. I stared at it. My brain tried to process what I was looking at. Why would a pack of apex predators kill another massive predator and just leave it? Why wouldn't they eat it? Why put it on my porch? And then, looking at the tracks in the snow, the horrifying reality of it finally clicked into place. They didn't come to kill me. They didn't come to break into my house. When you have a dog, hunting, But I wasn't the master. I never was. I looked up into the tree line. They hadn't left. They were just sitting just inside the shadows of the pines, all 5 of them, sitting perfectly still, watching me, waiting for me to accept the kill. That alpha, the one I saved, he wasn't paying off a debt. He was claiming me. I proved I had value. I proved I could heal. I was useful, so he brought his pack, and they secured the perimeter. They eliminated the other predators in the area, the bear, and they brought it to me. They were feeding me. I shut the door. I locked the deadbolt, but it doesn't matter. A lock won't stop them, and we both know it. I don't belong to myself anymore. I'm not a homeowner. I'm not a hunter. I'm the property of the pack. And as long as I stay inside this cabin, as long as I accept their gifts, I get to live.